Asserting central dominion, d4 immediately contests the d5 square and prepares for bishop development, aiming for a solid foundation. Developing a knight immediately asserts influence on the center, a flexible response that keeps many pawn structures open. Asserting central presence, this pawn grab immediately creates an imbalance and pressures black's knight. Striking back immediately, black challenges the center and opens dynamic diagonal lines. Embracing the central pawn advance, white immediately stakes a claim and disrupts black's pawn structure, forcing a strategic decision. Boldly challenging white's central grip, this pawn sacrifice opens sharp counterplay on the queenside. Striking at the pawn chain immediately weakens black's queenside pawn structure, opening lines for piece activity. Challenging white's pawn chain directly, black sacrifices material to disrupt the center and gain active counterplay on the queenside. Solidifying the center is crucial, preventing immediate counterplay and preparing for a controlled pawn push. Capturing that pawn opens up the file for your rook, creating immediate attacking pressure on white's queenside. Capturing the pawn immediately opens the bishop's diagonal, creating a sharp, tactical battleground where pawn structure weaknesses will become crucial. Unleashing the queen forces a positional concession, opening lines that might later prove problematic for the monarch. Developing the knight to c3 actively contests central squares while preparing castling, a crucial step in securing the king's safety. Developing the bishop to b7 fortifies the queenside and prepares for potential d-file pressure while adding an eye towards e4. Consolidating the knight's position offers a flexible defense against black's aggressive pawn structure. Unpinning the queen and reclaiming pawn material, black establishes central influence and prepares to activate their pieces. Securing the monarch amidst central dynamics truly solidifies white's position for future development. Actively developing the bishop aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and pressure the queen. Securing the queenside pawn majority while simultaneously reinforcing the central control offers a solid strategic foundation for white's development. Solidifying the center pawn and preparing to develop the kingside pieces creates a more robust pawn structure. Centralizing the e-pawn unleashes attacking potential and fights for space, potentially forcing a pawn exchange or opening lines. Sacrificing the bishop frees the queenside and opens lines for counterplay against white's exposed king. Reclaiming the central pawn with the knight opens lines and prepares further queenside pressure. A bold knight sacrifice, challenging the center and opening lines for attack, but leaving the king somewhat exposed to immediate threats. Unleashing a knight to pressure the pinned piece, aiming to disrupt black's control over the center and gain initiative. Re-establishing knight presence is key, aiming to challenge white's dominant central pawn structure and prepare for defensive repositioning. Recapturing the pawn on e1 activates the rook, aiming to pressure black's vulnerable central pawn and potentially threaten a discover attack on the queen. Developing the knight to the rim often signals a cautious approach, seeking safety rather than immediate central engagement. Challenging black's bishop, white aims to disrupt their coordination and perhaps open lines towards the king. The central pawn push destabilizes white's structure, aiming to seize the initiative and open lines. Igniting a central firestorm, this knight leap aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and launch a dangerous kingside attack. Shifting the queen to create attacking potential, while simultaneously defending the rook and preparing for future pawn advances. This maneuver aims to restrict black's minor pieces and gain space on the queenside. A bold venture aiming to exploit that loose knight, yet it could expose the queen to uncomfortable retreats. Eliminating black's knight opens critical lines for your pieces and exposes their weakened king position. Capturing the rook forces a fundamental shift toward an endgame with a material imbalance favoring white, demanding precise piece coordination from black. The rook now eyes the central files, aiming to support future pawn advances and establish dominance over the open lines. Doubling those pawns creates a central fortress, but at the cost of king's safety. Recapturing the pawn finally stabilizes white's central pawn structure, setting the stage for potential piece activity. Securing the king's eventual safety takes precedence now. Solidifying the central pawn and preparing to activate the rook on the second rank. Consolidating defensive strength, the bishop tucks away, seeking safety behind the pawn chain and preparing for a potential endgame skirmish. Unleashing the knight to harass the king and open lines feels like a decisive turning point. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount as the board simplifies, initiating the difficult endgame transition. Clearing the central files opens lines for rook activity and aims to exploit black's doubled pawns. This knight repositions to threaten white's advanced pawns and potentially attack the king's safety. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain creates a defensive bulwark, anticipating a potential queenside advance. Bringing the bishop to this active diagonal, black seeks to exchange pieces and simplify into a potentially favorable endgame. Reclaiming the open file should offer white increased pressure and central influence. A bold attempt to activate the rook, aiming to challenge white's dominant central presence and open lines for counterplay. Initiating a royal repositioning, prioritizing a safer square for the monarch in a complicated middle game. Trading rooks here simplifies into a challenging endgame where black's pawns are critically exposed. Regaining the pawn solidifies white's central structure and prepares to exploit the open files. The bishop retreats to a safer diagonal, preparing to contest the crucial central files and support potential pawn advances. Securing the monarch is paramount, ushering in a shift towards simplified exchanges and active rook repositioning. Pressing the rook to the open file initiates the endgame push, aiming to exploit the isolated d-pawn. Targeting the kingside pawns opens avenues for white's pieces. Reclaiming lost tempo, black anchors a knight on the advanced outpost, disrupting white's pawn structure and eyeing potential tactical lines. Repositioning the king seeks a safer haven amidst potential piece exchanges. A crucial repositioning, bringing the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside pawns and preparing to contest central squares. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, this move anticipates potential pawn pushes and creates a defensive barrier. Sensing a temporary lull, black retreats the bishop, potentially preparing to reposition it or challenge white's central pawns. Bringing the king forward initiates a daring endgame march, seeking active participation. Repositioning the knight to its advanced outpost creates tactical possibilities and aims to disrupt white's coordinated piece placement. Targeting the weak pawn on b8 now, aiming to exploit white's potential piece activity. Embrace the closing of ranks, solidify your king's safety by tucking him away. Seizing the open c-file, this knight aims to disrupt black's coordination and eye the weak pawn.